I was not invited to my own daughter's wedding. I simply packed my bags and flew to Maui instead. 2 weeks later, my phone lit up with 50 missed calls and a frantic voicemail screaming that the rent was overdue and demanding to know if I made the transfer. I replied with a single message stating I only finance the lives of those who deem me special enough to attend their wedding. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an ungrateful family member a harsh lesson about respect. The glowing screen of my laptop cast a harsh light across my mahogany desk in the quiet confines of my Portland home. With a single keystroke, I executed a bank transfer of exactly $3,500. The transaction cleared instantly, covering the monthly rent for Natalie's luxury downtown apartment. I assumed this heavy financial burden the day my wife passed away, silently stepping in to ensure our only daughter never felt the cold sting of instability. As a retired civil engineer, I spent my career designing load-bearing structures capable of withstanding immense pressure. I applied that exact same principle to my family, absorbing every financial shock without uttering a single word of complaint. I closed the banking application and reached for my phone, my mind entirely focused on the joy of giving my child the perfect day. I needed to confirm the final fitting schedule for her custom lace bridal gown. The heavy garment hung in my guest room closet, a $4,000 investment I made purely to see her smile. I dialed her number and waited through 3 rings. Natalie answered the video call with a chillingly casual tone. She sat on a sunlit patio sipping a vibrant cocktail, completely devoid of the pre-wedding stress I expected. I smiled and asked her what time we needed to be at the bridal boutique tomorrow for the final alterations. Natalie looked me right in the eye through the digital screen and stated with a cold, terrifying calmness that they already got married yesterday. She swirled her drink and added that they only invited special people. Those words hit me like a bucket of ice water. Special people. For 3 grueling years, I had quietly paid her exorbitant rent, fully furnished her pristine apartment, and kept her life entirely afloat while she pursued a career that paid entirely in exposure. Yet I was not considered a special person in her eyes. I sat paralyzed in the quiet living room of my own house, watching my daughter avoid my gaze while her new husband Cameron casually walked into the frame. The magnificent white dress I had purchased hung uselessly in my closet across the hall, entirely stripped of its purpose. It hung alongside the matching shoes and the shattered illusion of being part of the most important day of my only child's life. I had spent months planning every intricate detail of my involvement, carefully setting aside a substantial cash gift to present to them at the reception. All of those plans collapsed in a fraction of a second under the crushing weight of those poisoned words. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand an explanation or shed a single tear in front of her. The foundational pillars of my relationship with my daughter had just crumbled, and screaming would not reverse the structural failure. I stared at her screen, gave a single nod of absolute finality, and terminated the call without saying goodbye. The ensuing silence in my house was absolute. I stood up and walked down the hallway, staring at the closed door of the guest room, where the wedding dress waited for a bride who had deliberately erased me from her life. My role as a father had been forcefully and violently reduced to a functioning ATM. My presence was a hindrance, but my money was an absolute necessity. The grief inside my chest rapidly hardened into something incredibly cold and sharp. An engineer knows exactly what to do when a bridge is fundamentally compromised. You do not patch the cracks. You demolish the structure and rebuild from scratch. I walked back to my desk and opened my laptop once again. I systematically logged into every local account and canceled all my upcoming obligations in Portland. I suspended my utility payments, paused my mail delivery, and withdrew a significant amount of cash. I pulled a single leather travel bag from the top shelf of my closet and packed exactly 1 week worth of clothing. I did not leave a note. I did not send a follow-up text to Natalie demanding an apology or expressing my profound heartbreak. Instead, I accessed an airline portal and purchased a first-class one-way ticket to Maui. By vanishing without a single word of protest, I intentionally left a ticking financial time bomb buried deep inside Natalie's perfectly curated life. The automatic rent transfers were officially terminated. The credit cards were locked. The safety net was entirely dismantled. I locked the front door of my empty house, hailed a taxi to the airport, and boarded my flight. As the plane lifted off the runway and broke through the gray Portland clouds, I looked down at the shrinking city below. The storm was coming for them, and I would be watching it unfold from paradise. 2 weeks. 14 days of absolute, uninterrupted silence. I sat on a sun-drenched balcony in Maui, letting the warm, salt-laced Pacific breeze wash over my face. The rhythmic, relentless crashing of the waves against the jagged volcanic rocks below served as a constant reminder of the profound physical and emotional distance I had placed between myself and Portland. As a retired civil engineer, I spent my entire career calculating stress loads, analyzing tension points, and building structures specifically designed to withstand the harshest, most unforgiving elements. For 65 years, I applied that exact same rigorous discipline to my own family. I was the load-bearing pillar. I silently absorbed every shock, every financial tremor, and every emotional earthquake Natalie ever caused. I reinforced her life with my own stability. But standing on that balcony, staring at the endless blue horizon, I finally realized the profound peace that comes from simply stepping back and letting a fundamentally flawed structure collapse under its own weight. I had not spoken a single word to my daughter since the exact moment she stared through a video screen, smiled coldly, and informed me that my presence was not required at her wedding. I had calmly packed a bag, boarded a plane, and left behind the $4,000 custom lace gown I had purchased. I left behind the meticulously planned cash gift I had saved for her future. I left behind the illusion of my fatherhood. I surrendered her completely to the care of her new husband, Cameron, and the exclusive list of special people she deemed worthy of witnessing her vows. For 14 days, my phone remained locked inside the heavy steel safe of my hotel room. I needed a complete, uncompromising detox from the toxic expectation of being her endless financial reservoir. But today was the 4th day of the new month. Today was the day the carefully constructed artificial reality Natalie lived in would inevitably and violently collide with the truth. I walked back into the cool, air-conditioned suite, unlocked the heavy steel door of the safe, and retrieved the device. I pressed the power button. The screen illuminated the dim room, and immediately the phone began to vibrate violently in my hand. It was a digital avalanche. The notification chime rang in a relentless, chaotic sequence that seemed to echo through the quiet room. 50 missed calls, dozens of frantic text messages, a barrage of desperate voicemails. The screen was entirely filled with Natalie's name glowing like a frantic distress flare in the dark. I walked back out to the balcony, sat down in the woven wicker chair, and slowly poured myself a cup of black coffee. I did not rush. Panic is a highly contagious disease that thrives on urgency, and I absolutely refused to catch it. I took a sip of the bitter coffee, watching a distant sailboat cut through the water, and pressed play on the first voicemail. The first message was dated the 1st of the month. Natalie sounded mildly annoyed, her voice laced with the heavy, familiar entitlement I had unknowingly nurtured for decades. She demanded to know why the automatic transfer had not hit her checking account. She reminded me that the rent for her luxury downtown apartment was due, speaking to me not as a daughter addressing her father, but as an arrogant employer reprimanding a negligent payroll clerk. She instructed me to fix the banking glitch immediately before she went out for her post-wedding brunch. I deleted the message. I pressed play on the second voicemail, recorded late on the 2nd of the month. The mild annoyance had sharpened into genuine, aggressive anger. She shouted into the receiver, demanding I pick up the phone right that second. She complained loudly that Cameron was stressed and that her perfect honeymoon bliss was being ruined by my irresponsible behavior. She threatened to ignore me for a month if I did not rectify the financial error instantly. The sheer audacity of her threat made me take another slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. She was actually threatening to withhold her presence as a punishment, completely oblivious to the undeniable fact that she had already permanently and violently severed our bond. The tone of the messages drastically shifted by the morning of the third day. The next voicemail crackled with pure, unfiltered panic. Natalie was audibly hyperventilating. The prestigious property management company overseeing her luxury high-rise did not tolerate late payments from anyone. They had officially issued a severe penalty notice. The $3,500 rent was now inflated to over $4,000 with immediate late fees. A rigid 3-day notice to pay or quit the premises had been taped directly to her pristine mahogany front door for all her wealthy neighbors to see. Her voice trembled violently as she begged me to call the bank. She pleaded with me to wire the funds instantly, desperately claiming there must be some terrible systemic mistake with my personal accounts. She then handed the phone to Cameron. Cameron aggressively commanded me to act like a man and handle my financial obligations to his wife. He yelled that I was putting their future in jeopardy over a petty grievance. Hearing his arrogant, entitled voice demanding my hard-earned money to secure the roof over his head solidified my cold resolve. I had quietly subsidized his lavish lifestyle for 3 years, while he contributed absolutely nothing but empty promises, failed business ventures, and condescending smirks. I deleted his voice from my device. I listened to the final voicemail recorded just hours ago. Natalie was sobbing uncontrollably, her breath catching in her throat. The devastating reality of her exclusion had finally hit her bank account with full force. She cried that they had absolutely zero savings. She confessed that they had spent every last dime of their available credit on the secret, extravagant wedding reception in the private vineyard. They had nothing left to appease the ruthless landlord. She begged me to save her from eviction, promising we could sit down and talk about the wedding. Misunderstanding later, but fiercely demanding. I transfer the money right this second to prevent illegal filing. A misunderstanding. That was the pathetic word she chose to describe the deliberate, cruel choice to erase her father from the most important day of her life. She still blindly believed my love was an unconditional currency she could withdraw at will. She still believed I was the silent safety net waiting patiently to catch her after she willfully leaped off a cliff of disrespect. Natalie did not know the intricate legal details of her own lease agreement. 2 years ago, when she demanded that specific luxury apartment, her sporadic income as a freelance consultant and Cameron's non-existent salary disqualified them immediately. I had stepped in without hesitation and signed as the primary financial guarantor. I tied the exorbitant monthly payments directly to my personal accounts to ensure she never faced the indignity of a rejection. But before I boarded the flight to Maui, I systematically dismantled that entire arrangement. I formally and legally withdrew my status as her guarantor. I severed the automatic bank connection. I legally shifted the massive, crushing burden of her lavish lifestyle squarely onto her and her new husband's shoulders. The property management company was simply enforcing the strict financial terms she was now solely responsible for maintaining. I placed the phone down on the glass table. The Pacific Ocean stretched out endlessly before me, perfectly calm, unimaginably deep, and completely untroubled by the financial storm raging in Portland. For 65 years, I built strong bridges to carry the heavy weight of others. Today, I sat in silence and watched one burn to the ground. I opened the messaging application on my phone. I did not write a lengthy emotional explanation. I did not express my profound heartbreak or my lingering grief. Exhaustive explanations are reserved for people who deserve second chances, and Natalie had completely exhausted her supply. I typed a single decisive response, preparing to send the final consequence of her actions. The conflict was no longer mine to carry. It belonged entirely to them. The barrage of digital notifications continued to rattle against the glass table on my balcony. I watched the screen light up with a relentless, pulsating sequence of text messages. The initial wave of furious, entitled demands had completely evaporated. Anger requires a captive audience, and my absolute silence had starved Natalie of the reaction she desperately craved. The tone of her messages rapidly dissolved into a frantic, chaotic pleading. I picked up the device and read the blocks of text appearing on the screen. She wrote that the property manager had just handed her a formal eviction warning, printed on heavy legal paper and taped directly to her front door. She typed that Cameron was pacing the floor of their apartment and threatening to leave their honeymoon suite because the financial stress was unbearable. She begged me to answer the phone, calling me by the childhood nickname she had not used since she was a little girl running through our backyard in Portland. It was a masterful display of emotional manipulation. For 30 years, that specific tone of voice would have commanded my immediate, unconditional surrender. I would have rushed to my banking application, transferred the necessary funds, and apologized for causing her any distress. I had spent my entire adult life cushioning her from the harsh realities of the real world. I paid her college tuition in full, so she would never know the burden of student loans. I bought her reliable cars so she would never have to wait in the rain for public transportation. But a civil engineer understands the fundamental laws of structural integrity. If you constantly absorb the impact for a flawed structure, that structure never learns to support its own weight. I stared at her final message. She wrote that she was deeply sorry for the misunderstanding regarding the wedding invitations and promised we could resolve everything over a nice dinner if I just sent the rent money immediately. A misunderstanding. The word sat there on the glowing screen entirely devoid of accountability. Excluding her father from the most significant milestone of her life was a deliberate, calculated strike. She had proudly stood in her custom bridal gown, surrounded by the people she deemed worthy, and shut the door in my face. Now facing the immediate consequence of a locked bank account, she attempted to package her cruelty as a simple scheduling error. I felt a profound sense of clarity wash over me. The crushing weight of paternal obligation that I had carried since the day she was born simply vanished. I realized that yielding to her tears now would only validate her terrible behavior. It would teach her that my dignity could be purchased with a superficial apology. I opened the messaging application. I did not draft a long, emotional essay detailing my heartbreak. I did not list the thousands of dollars I had sacrificed for her comfort over the years. Engaging in a debate would only provide her with ammunition to continue the argument. I needed to establish a boundary made of solid steel. My fingers moved across the digital keyboard with absolute precision. I typed a single definitive sentence. I stated that I only provide financial support to the people who consider me family. I read the words twice to ensure they conveyed exactly what I intended. There was no anger in the message, only a cold, undeniable truth. I pressed send. I watched the small indicator confirm the message had been delivered to her device. I did not wait for the inevitable explosion of replies. I did not give her the opportunity to launch another barrage of excuses or venomous insults. I pressed the power button on the side of the device and held it down until the screen went completely black. The cord was cut. The heavy invisible chain that had tethered my bank account to her endless demands was permanently severed. I placed the lifeless phone back into my luggage and zipped it shut. I walked back out onto the balcony and gripped the wooden railing. The warm Hawaiian sun beat down on my shoulders. I took a deep breath of the salt-laced air filling my lungs with a sense of freedom I had not experienced since my wife passed away. I had finally prioritized my own self-respect over the bottomless pit of my daughter's entitlement. I felt incredibly light. I watched the waves crash against the shoreline, admiring the raw, unyielding power of the ocean. For several hours, I sat in that wicker chair and simply watched the world move around me. I allowed myself to grieve the daughter I thought I had raised, while simultaneously making peace with the stranger she had become. The afternoon slowly faded into a brilliant, fiery sunset. I decided to head inside and prepare for a quiet dinner. I felt completely detached from the chaos I had left behind in Oregon. I believed the conflict was entirely resolved. I believed my single message had firmly closed the door on the situation. I was completely wrong. I walked over to the small desk in the corner of the suite and opened my laptop. I intended to check my travel itinerary and perhaps book a snorkeling tour for the following morning. I connected to the secure hotel network. The moment the internet connection stabilized, my email application refreshed automatically. The screen was instantly flooded with urgent, high-priority notifications. They were not from Natalie. They were not angry emails from Cameron or confused messages from distant relatives. The emails were automated alerts from my primary wealth management firm. The subject lines were printed in bold, glaring red text. The system warned of multiple consecutive failed login attempts on my master retirement portfolio. The portfolio contained my entire life savings, the life insurance payouts from my wife's passing, and the accumulated wealth of a 40-year engineering career. I felt a sudden icy knot form in the pit of my stomach. I opened the most recent alert and scanned the detailed security log. Someone in Portland was actively attempting to breach my financial accounts. They were not using random guesses. The security log showed they were systematically entering old passwords, using variations of my late wife's maiden name, my social security number, and specific dates of birth. The precision of the attack was terrifying. This was an intimate, highly knowledgeable intrusion. The sheer scale of the betrayal expanded rapidly in my mind. This was no longer a domestic dispute over unpaid rent. This was no longer a spoiled child throwing a tantrum over a locked checking account. The situation had escalated from emotional manipulation directly into a coordinated financial crime. Natalie and Cameron were not simply crying in their apartment. They were actively sitting in front of a computer, desperately trying to hack into my life savings to steal the funds they felt entitled to take. The boundary I had just established had not stopped them. It had only forced them to abandon their fake apologies and resort to outright theft. The peaceful Hawaiian evening suddenly felt suffocating. I slammed the laptop shut, my hands trembling with a mixture of absolute horror and a cold, calculating rage. I needed professional reinforcement immediately. I reached for my travel bag to find the business card for my lawyer, Russell. The war had just begun. I closed the lid of my laptop and let the profound silence of the Hawaiian afternoon settle around me. The rhythmic sound of the Pacific Ocean washing against the volcanic rocks below should have been a soothing balm to my frayed nerves. I walked back out to the balcony and let the warm trade winds wash over my face. I had done what was necessary. I had severed the financial umbilical cord that bound me to an ungrateful child and a parasitic son-in-law. I believed the surgical removal of my support would simply result in them facing the harsh reality of their own exorbitant choices. I believed the situation was contained. I took a deep breath of the salt, heavy air and allowed myself a rare moment of vulnerability to mourn the daughter I had lost. That quiet peace lasted exactly 14 minutes. The sudden piercing shriek of an electronic alarm shattered the tranquility of the hotel suite. It was not the standard chime of an incoming email or the soft ping of a calendar reminder. It was a high-frequency, continuous tone specifically engineered to induce immediate panic. I recognized the sound instantly. It was the emergency breach protocol from my encrypted tablet resting on the mahogany desk inside the room. I stepped off the balcony and strode across the suite. The tablet screen was flashing a brilliant warning red, casting harsh shadows against the walls. The notification banner displayed the crest of my primary wealth management firm. The firm held the entirety of my life savings, including the massive life insurance payout from my late wife and the accumulated dividends of a 40-year career in civil engineering. I picked up the device and bypassed the biometric lock with a steady thumb. The security portal materialized on the screen, detailing a catastrophic sequence of events currently unfolding in real time. My account was under a brute force digital attack. Someone was actively attempting to penetrate the heavily fortified firewalls of my retirement portfolio. The security log listed 7 consecutive failed login attempts within the span of 3 minutes. The system had automatically initiated a temporary lockdown protocol, preventing any outgoing transfers, but the attacker was relentlessly pounding against the digital gates. I clicked on the origin tracking data. The primary IP address was poorly masked, routing through a cheap commercial virtual private network, but the secondary network pings betrayed the true location. The attacks were originating from a residential internet service provider in downtown Portland. They were coming directly from the luxury apartment I had furnished for my daughter. I sat down heavily in the leather desk chair and stared at the glowing logs. The sheer audacity of the attack was difficult to process, but it was the specific methodology that turned my blood completely to ice. The security system displayed the exact alphanumeric sequences the attacker was using to try and bypass my secondary authentication measures. They were not random strings of characters generated by a hacking program. They were highly specific, intimate passwords. The attacker was entering my deceased wife's maiden name, followed by the year we were married. The next failed attempt utilized the name of her childhood dog combined with her old area code. The final attempt before the system locked down completely was the exact alphanumeric code she used for her personal banking before the cancer took her. A cold, sickening realization washed over me. During the painful weeks following my wife's funeral, Natalie had offered to help me organize her mother's personal effects. I had been paralyzed by grief, unable to face the task of sorting through the physical remnants of a 40-year marriage. Natalie had spent hours in the home office carefully boxing up files and clearing out the desk drawers. I had trusted her completely. I had thanked her for taking that heavy burden off my shoulders. I now realized that while I was weeping in the living room, my daughter was systematically documenting her dead mother's confidential information. She had found the small leather notebook where my wife kept her private passwords, and she had kept it. She had hoarded that sensitive data for years, keeping it as a digital skeleton key just in case she ever needed to unlock my financial vaults. The emotional devastation of that betrayal threatened to overwhelm me, but I pushed it down with the practiced discipline of an engineer facing a structural emergency. Grief is a luxury you can only afford when the building is not actively collapsing on top of you. I compartmentalized the pain and shifted my entire cognitive focus to the threat at hand. This was no longer a domestic dispute over unpaid rent or wedding invitations. This was not a spoiled child throwing a tantrum because her credit card was declined. This was a calculated, cold-blooded financial crime. Natalie and Cameron had crossed a terrifying threshold. They had transitioned from parasitic beneficiaries to active predators. They were attempting to steal millions of dollars to fund a lifestyle they could not sustain. I looked at the total balance displayed behind the locked security screen. The portfolio represented decades of concrete poured, steel beams laid, and bridges constructed. It was the tangible result of my life's work. The thought of Cameron using my money to finance another failed startup, or Natalie draining those accounts to maintain a facade of wealth for her social circle, filled me with a deep, uncompromising rage. They believed my silence over the past 2 weeks was a sign of weakness. They assumed my sudden departure to Maui meant I was a fragile old man running away from conflict. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the man they were dealing with. I do not run from conflict. I step back to assess the structural integrity of the battlefield before I demolish the opposition. I reached into my travel bag and retrieved a heavily encrypted satellite phone. I do not use standard cellular networks for highly sensitive financial communications. I dialed a direct line that bypassed all receptionists and administrative assistants. I was calling Russell, my personal financial attorney. Russell is not a family lawyer. He does not handle emotional disputes or mediation. He is a ruthless corporate litigator who specializes in asset protection and hostile takeovers. He is a shark in a tailored suit, and he is the exact weapon I needed to deploy against my own flesh and blood. The line rang twice before a crisp, authoritative voice answered. Russell did not offer pleasantries, and I did not provide any. I value complete transparency and brutal efficiency in my professional communications. I stated my name and informed him that we had a critical emergency requiring immediate extreme action. I detailed the security breach outlining the origin of the attacks and the specific passwords being utilized. I informed him that my daughter and her husband were actively attempting to compromise my entire estate. I instructed him to treat this not as a familial misunderstanding, but as an organized criminal enterprise targeting my wealth. Russell did not hesitate. His voice remained perfectly level as he outlined the immediate countermeasures. He initiated a total asset freeze on all my accounts, placing them under a legal lock that required multiple physical signatures to access. He deployed a team of forensic digital auditors to secure the electronic footprints of the breach, ensuring we had undeniable proof of the origin location and the specific methods used. He advised me that this level of evidence was essential for the inevitable legal war we were about to launch. I agreed completely. I instructed him to prepare the most aggressive offensive strategy the law allowed. Russell explained the precise legal mechanisms he was activating. We were not merely stopping a theft, we were constructing an inescapable legal cage. He drafted an immediate injunction against the property management company in Portland, forcing them to preserve all security footage and digital access logs for Natalie's building. We needed to place her and Cameron directly behind the keyboard at the exact moment the breach was attempted. Russell also contacted the federal authorities specializing in wire fraud and digital identity theft. Because they were attempting to access interstate financial institutions, the crime immediately escalated to a federal level. I listened to his rapid tactical deployment with clinical satisfaction. My daughter had assumed she was simply picking a digital lock, but she had unknowingly triggered a massive federal snare. I hung up the secure phone and looked out the window of the hotel suite. The vibrant blue sky of the Hawaiian afternoon had begun to shift into the deep, bruised purples of twilight. The vacation was officially over. The temporary peace I had sought on this island had been violently ripped away by the boundless greed of my own child. I packed my laptop and the encrypted phone back into my leather travel bag. I was no longer a grieving father trying to teach an ungrateful daughter a lesson about respect. I was an architect preparing to tear down a condemned building. Natalie and Cameron had decided to declare war on my life's work. They were about to discover the terrifying consequences of attacking a man who builds fortresses for a living. I walked out of the hotel room, leaving the paradise behind, ready to bring the entire structure crashing down on their heads. The flight back to Portland took exactly 5 hours and 40 minutes. I spent every single minute of that journey staring out the small oval window of the first-class cabin, watching the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean disappear beneath the clouds. I did not sleep. I did not accept the complimentary champagne or watch the in-flight entertainment. My mind was entirely consumed by the architectural blueprint of my impending retaliation. I had left the island of Maui as a father, mourning the brutal loss of a daughter. I was returning to the mainland as an engineer, tasked with demolishing a deeply compromised structure. The tropical paradise I had sought refuge in was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating determination. I mentally reviewed every financial asset, every legal document, and every vulnerability I possessed. I needed to ensure my defenses were absolutely impenetrable before I launched my offensive strike. Nobody knew I was on that plane. I was a ghost moving through the international airport entirely undetected. When the wheels touched down on the wet tarmac of Portland International Airport, the familiar gray drizzle washed over the windows, perfectly matching the cold, absolute resolve solidifying in my chest. I retrieved my single leather travel bag from the overhead bin and walked through the terminal with the purposeful stride of a man who knows exactly what needs to be done. There was no hesitation in my steps. The grief that had paralyzed me just weeks ago had been entirely incinerated by the sheer audacity of their financial attack. I stepped out into the crisp, damp air and hailed a waiting taxi. I gave the driver the address for downtown, but as we merged onto the highway, we approached the familiar exit that led directly to my quiet suburban neighborhood. For a brief, fleeting second, my instincts told me to go home. I wanted to unlock my front door, walk into my kitchen, and pretend the last 3 weeks had simply been an incredibly vivid nightmare. I wanted to sit in my leather armchair and wait for Natalie to call me and tell me she was coming over for Sunday dinner. But that home no longer existed. The sanctuary I had built for my family was completely compromised. Natalie and Cameron had fundamentally violated the sanctuary of my trust, and returning to that house without a bulletproof strategy was tactical suicide. If I went home now, I would be walking blindly into whatever physical or legal trap they were undoubtedly setting. I instructed the driver to keep his eyes on the road and bypass my exit completely. I watched the green highway sign indicating my neighborhood blur past the rain-streaked window and fade into the distance. I felt a profound sense of detachment. I was no longer the loving father desperately trying to fix his child's mistakes. I was an investigator gathering critical data in hostile territory. I needed to operate entirely in the shadows until I possessed undeniable proof of their crimes. The taxi navigated the busy downtown traffic and pulled up to a towering skyscraper made of steel and reflective glass. This was the fortress where my financial attorney, Russell, conducted his daily operations. I paid the driver, stepped out into the pouring rain, and walked through the revolving glass doors of the massive lobby. I did not stop at the security desk to announce my arrival. Russell and I had coordinated this covert meeting while I was standing on the balcony in Hawaii. He had arranged for me to have unrestricted access to the secure executive elevators. I was completely off the grid. I rode the elevator up to the 42nd floor in total silence, watching the numbers climb higher and higher above the city streets. The heavy oak doors of the law firm parted, and Russell was already standing in the reception area waiting for me. There were no warm handshakes or sympathetic smiles. Russell operated with a level of ruthless efficiency that I deeply respected. He simply nodded, turned on his heel, and led me down a long, pristine hallway toward a soundproof conference room located at the very back of the building. We were preparing for a financial war, and the briefing room was appropriately sterile. The room was heavily secured, devoid of any windows that could compromise the integrity of our conversation. A massive mahogany table dominated the center of the space, covered in thick legal binders, printed bank statements, and 2 high-powered laptop computers. Sitting at the head of the table was a younger man, wearing a sharp tailored suit and wire-rimmed glasses. Russell introduced him as a premier digital forensic specialist, hired exclusively to audit the massive security breach on my retirement accounts. This man was the best in the business, tasked with unraveling the digital threads my son-in-law had carelessly left behind. I took a seat at the table and placed my hands flat against the cool, polished wood. I looked at Russell and instructed him to show me exactly what we were dealing with. The forensic specialist turned his laptop screen toward me and brought up a series of highly complex data logs. He explained that the attacker had been incredibly aggressive, but fundamentally sloppy. They had utilized a commercial virtual private network to mask their location, believing the cheap encryption software would render them completely invisible. It was the digital equivalent of wearing a cheap plastic mask to rob a heavily fortified bank. The arrogance of the attempt was almost as insulting as the theft itself. The specialist walked me through the intricate process of peeling back the layers of digital deception. My primary wealth management firm employed military-grade security protocols. The moment the unauthorized access attempts registered on their servers, they did not just block the intrusion, they actively traced the digital footprint backward. We watched the lines of code scroll across the screen, identifying the specific proxy servers the attacker bounced through, before finally revealing the true point of origin. The specialist tapped his keyboard, isolating the exact transmission source. The final set of coordinates materialized on the screen, illuminating the dark room with a harsh, glaring truth. The IP address did not belong to a shadowy syndicate of international hackers or a random overseas phishing operation. The digital footprint led straight back to a premium internet service provider account, registered in downtown Portland. The exact service address printed on the screen belonged to the luxury high-rise apartment building. The very same apartment building where I had faithfully paid the exorbitant rent for the past 3 years. The attacker was not a faceless criminal. The attacker was Cameron. My son-in-law was sitting in the living room I had fully furnished, using the high-speed internet connection I had established, aggressively attempting to drain my entire life savings. He was using the intimate knowledge of my deceased wife's passwords that Natalie had gathered from my home office to try and force his way into my retirement portfolio. They were using my own grief and vulnerability as a weapon against me. I stared at the address on the screen and felt a terrifying calmness settle over my entire body. They were so blinded by their own towering entitlement that they actually believed I was a defenseless old man, completely ignorant of modern technology. They assumed I would panic and blindly surrender my assets to make the security alerts stop. They had significantly underestimated the man they decided to steal from. They thought they were dealing with a pushover, but they had just awakened a sleeping giant. I looked across the table at Russell and told him we had everything we needed to launch a devastating counteroffensive. The dynamic of the entire situation completely reversed in that very room. The perpetrators were sitting in their apartment, believing they were safely executing a brilliant financial heist. They had absolutely no idea that I was sitting less than 5 miles away, meticulously mapping out their total destruction. The hunter had officially become the hunted. I instructed the forensic specialist to secure every single digital log, compile the evidence into a legally binding affidavit, and prepare to hand it over to the federal authorities. The time for silent observation was officially over. It was time to strike back with overwhelming, undeniable force. I sat in the climate-controlled silence of the downtown law firm, feeling the last remnants of my paternal devotion evaporate into the sterile air. Russell placed a heavy manila folder onto the center of the polished mahogany table. There was no hesitation in his movements and no pity in his eyes. He operated with the clinical precision of a surgeon about to reveal a terminal diagnosis. He opened the folder and began to spread a series of certified financial records across the smooth wooden surface. These were not the simple checking account statements I was accustomed to reviewing. These were deeply buried transaction logs retrieved through our covert forensic audit. I leaned forward and picked up the first stack of papers. The crisp white pages felt incredibly heavy in my hands. I ran my index fingers down the itemized columns of expenditures. The chronological dates perfectly aligned with the 6 months leading up to Natalie and Cameron's wedding. My eyes scanned the vendor names and the staggering dollar amounts attached to each line item. The financial reality of their special day began to materialize before me in stark black ink. There was a $15,000 wire transfer to a boutique catering company renowned for high-end organic cuisine. I found an $8,000 charge processed by a premium floral designer specializing in imported exotic orchids. I saw a $12,000 payment allocated for a fleet of luxury transportation vehicles. The most devastating revelation was a massive $50,000 deposit paid directly to an exclusive private vineyard located in the wealthiest district of the wine country. I sat back in my leather chair and stared at the final calculated tally at the bottom of the page. The total expenditure for the wedding event exceeded $100,000. The words Natalie had spoken to me through our final video call echoed loudly in the quiet room. She had looked me right in the eye and claimed the ceremony was a small, intimate gathering. She had stated they only invited a handful of witnesses to keep things strictly private. It was a spectacular and meticulously calculated lie. They had not hosted a quiet elopement on a budget. They had thrown a massive, lavish gala designed to impress the upper echelon of their social circle. The rejection I had experienced in my living room completely transformed into a chilling clarity. They did not exclude me because I was not a special person. They excluded me because my physical presence at a $100,000 luxury vineyard wedding would have immediately exposed their magnificent financial illusion. They desperately needed me thousands of miles away from Portland, so I would never have the opportunity to ask how two people with zero accumulated savings could suddenly afford a royal celebration. My absence was not a personal slight. It was a critical tactical requirement for their deception to succeed. I looked across the vast conference table at my attorney. I told Russell that the mathematical equation sitting in front of me was fundamentally broken. I knew exactly how much money Natalie earned as a struggling freelance consultant. I knew Cameron had been entirely unemployed for the better part of a year, loudly claiming he was waiting for the perfect entrepreneurial opportunity to present itself. They barely possessed enough liquid cash to cover their basic monthly groceries, which was precisely why I had been silently paying their exorbitant apartment rent for 3 entire years. I asked my lawyer where $100,000 in clean, untraceable cash had miraculously appeared from. Russell did not answer my question verbally. He simply reached out and slid the second stack of authenticated documents toward me. The bold logo printed across the top of the page belonged to a major national banking institution. It was a formal approval letter for a massive revolving line of credit. The names listed as the primary account holders were Natalie and Cameron. I read the specific terms of the financial agreement. The bank had officially approved them for $250,000 in liquid funding. I felt my heart begin to beat, with a slow, heavy, and dangerous rhythm. As a civil engineer, I spent my entire professional life calculating risk factors and securing structural foundations. I knew exactly how the banking system operated. No legitimate financial institution in the country would ever hand $250,000 to an unemployed man and a struggling freelancer without requiring substantial collateral. You simply do not get a loan of that magnitude without leveraging a concrete asset of equal or far greater value. I turned the page with a terrifying certainty of what I was about to find. I looked directly at the collateral agreement. The asset securing their extravagant wedding, their luxury lifestyle, and their limitless credit was a piece of residential real estate. I read the specific address printed in stark black ink and felt the oxygen leave my lungs. It was my address. It was the home I had purchased with my late wife over 30 years ago. It was the house we had meticulously paid off, completely free and clear of any outstanding debt. Natalie and Cameron had not simply opened a new credit card. They had secretly and fraudulently mortgaged my primary residence. They had leveraged the very roof over my head to finance their champagne toasts and imported floral arrangements. I stared closely at the signatures located at the bottom of the loan origination documents. There was Natalie's familiar looping handwriting right next to Cameron's sharp, aggressive signature. And placed directly beneath theirs was my own signature, perfectly replicated on the primary authorization line. The sheer mechanical audacity of the crime left me breathless. They had bypassed standard banking security protocols by weaponizing their status as trusted family members. They had used my absolute unconditional trust as a blunt instrument to smash through the legal safeguards designed specifically to prevent this exact type of catastrophic financial abuse. A profound and heavy silence settled over the conference room. I did not yell or strike the table in anger. The father who would have wept at this profound betrayal was entirely dead and gone. The man sitting in that chair was an architect examining a fundamentally compromised structure. My daughter had not just taken advantage of my generosity. She had actively conspired to steal my home and encumber my future with a mountain of toxic debt. She had traded my lifelong financial security for a single day of superficial glory. Every ounce of paternal instinct I possessed was systematically dismantled by the cold, hard facts printed on the pages in front of me. I looked up at Russell and met his gaze. The grim expression on his face confirmed that he understood the absolute gravity of our situation. We were no longer dealing with a familial dispute over personal boundaries. We were staring directly at multiple counts of severe federal financial fraud, identity theft, and elder exploitation. They had constructed a massive, delicate house of cards entirely funded by my stolen equity. They believed their secret was completely safe because they assumed I was too old and too naive to ever audit my own property records. I gathered the loose documents and aligned them into a neat, perfect stack on the table. I told Russell that we needed to understand exactly how they managed to bypass the strict notary requirements and secure my legal signature without my knowledge. The answer to that specific question was already forming in the back of my mind. A dark, terrible memory from exactly 1 year ago began to surface rapidly. A memory of recovering from a complex medical procedure, with my vision completely blurred and my daughter rushing into my home with a thick stack of urgent municipal tax papers demanding my immediate signature. The puzzle pieces were violently snapping together. The full scope of their predatory behavior was coming into sharp focus, and I knew exactly what I had to do next. I sat perfectly still in the sterile, climate-controlled conference room of the downtown law firm. The heavy Portland rain battered relentlessly against the floor-to-ceiling windows, a stark and violent contrast to the warm Hawaiian breeze I had left behind just hours ago. My eyes were locked completely onto the heavily embossed mortgage documents spread across the polished mahogany table. The signatures at the bottom of the pages were undeniably mine. I knew my own handwriting implicitly. I knew the specific slant of the letters, the precise pressure of the ink, the way the final loop trailed off at the end of my last name. Russell sat across from me in total silence, his hands steepled, giving me the necessary space to process the impossible truth sitting in front of us. My mind raced backward, tearing through the meticulously organized files of my memory. I had never willingly encumbered my property. I had never walked into a bank to leverage the home I built with my late wife. I owned that house free and clear for decades. Yet the ink on the paper was real. The legal binding was absolute. I closed my eyes and let the timeline rewind. The disjointed pieces of the puzzle shifted, clicked, and finally locked together with a sickening, devastating clarity. Exactly 1 year ago, the world was a hazy blur of distorted shadows and muted light. I had just undergone intensive cataract surgery on both of my eyes. It was a delicate, necessary medical procedure, one that required days of absolute rest and severe visual restriction. I spent those first few days navigating my own home by memory alone, my eyes covered by thick, protective plastic shields. The physical vulnerability was immense and entirely foreign to me. As a man who had spent his entire adult life measuring, drafting, and relying on absolute visual precision to build massive structures, the temporary blindness left me profoundly disoriented. I was stripped of my independence. I was forced to rely completely on the environment I had built and the people I trusted most in the world to keep me safe while I healed. It was late on a Tuesday afternoon when my front door opened. I heard the familiar sharp clicking of Natalie's designer heels striking the hardwood floor of the hallway. She brought the scent of expensive floral perfume and the crisp, cold air of the autumn evening into the living room. Her voice was unusually soft, dripping with a manufactured sweetness that I now recognize as the ultimate predator's camouflage. She asked how I was feeling. She guided me back to my leather recliner with a gentle, seemingly affectionate hand on my shoulder. I was profoundly grateful for her presence. I believed with the foolish, unconditional faith of a father that my only child had come to care for me in my moment of absolute weakness. I believed she was stepping up to fill the void her mother had left behind. She sat on the edge of the sofa beside me and let out a heavy, exaggerated sigh. She claimed she had stopped by my mailbox to bring in the Daily Post and found something incredibly urgent. Her voice took on a tone of frantic, breathless concern. She told me the city had issued a final demanding notice regarding an obscure municipal tax assessment on the property. She insisted the deadline was that very afternoon, and failure to comply immediately would result in catastrophic financial penalties and a potential lien against the house. She painted a picture of bureaucratic chaos perfectly designed to trigger the practical problem-solving nature of an engineer. I could not read the papers. The world around me was a hazy gray fog. I asked her to summarize the documents, and she lied to my face with the effortless sociopathic grace of a seasoned criminal. She placed a thick stack of papers directly onto my lap. The weight of the documents felt substantial, far too thick for a simple municipal tax form. But I dismissed the inconsistency, trusting her summary completely. She uncapped a heavy luxury pen and placed it directly into my waiting hand. She physically guided my fingers to the exact locations on the pages. "Sign right here, Dad," she whispered softly. "Just right here on the dotted line. I will take everything straight to the county clerk's office and handle this entire mess for you so you can just rest." I felt the rough texture of the paper beneath my palm. I pressed the pen down and signed my name blindly over and over again, across pages I could not see. I signed away my equity. I signed away my financial security. I signed the instrument of my own destruction, thanking her profusely the entire time for being such a wonderful, attentive daughter. The memory shattered, slamming me violently back into the cold reality of the conference room. The air in my lungs felt suddenly heavy and toxic. The documents sitting on the mahogany table were not municipal tax forms. They were the very same papers she had placed on my lap that Tuesday afternoon. While I sat in darkness, physically impaired, and completely reliant on her compassion. Natalie had systematically mortgaged my life to fund her vanity. She had weaponized my blindness. She had transformed my absolute unconditional trust into a financial sledgehammer, striking at the very foundation of my estate to pay for imported wine and exotic floral arrangements. The level of premeditation required to execute such a maneuver was staggering. She did not stumble into this crime in a moment of desperation or panic. She planned it carefully. She waited for my most vulnerable hour, walked into my home with a forged narrative, and handed me the pen to seal my own fate. A profound, terrifying silence descended over my mind. The initial shock evaporated into the conditioned air of the room. The deep, agonizing heartbreak of a betrayed father burned away completely, leaving behind nothing but a cold, engineered rage. When a structural support fails due to natural wear and tear, you fix it with patience and care. But when a support is intentionally and maliciously sabotaged, you do not mourn the material. You neutralize the threat entirely. Natalie and Cameron had operated under the fatal assumption that my paternal love would act as a permanent, impenetrable shield against consequence. They believed the old man would simply absorb the massive financial loss, too ashamed, too blind, or too exhausted to fight back. They confused my quiet generosity with pathetic weakness. I looked across the table at Russell. My voice was completely steady, stripped of any lingering sentimentality or hesitation. I told my lawyer that we were no longer treating this as a family matter or a civil dispute. The people who forged this debt were not my daughter and son-in-law. They were hostile actors who had breached my perimeter and attempted to destroy my life. I instructed Russell to prepare the absolute maximum legal retaliation available under state and federal law. There would be no warnings issued. There would be no polite requests for repayment or tearful family interventions designed to seek closure. We were going to dismantle their stolen, luxurious lives brick by brick, account by account, until they had absolutely nothing left but the crushing weight of their own arrogance. The blueprint for their ruin was firmly set, and I was fully prepared to pour the concrete. The conference room in Russell's downtown firm was a fortress of glass and steel. The relentless Portland rain battered the heavy window panes, providing a steady, rhythmic drumbeat to our grim discoveries. We had just finished mapping out the fraudulent mortgage details when a sharp vibration rattled against the polished mahogany table. It was my private cellular device, the screen illuminated with a harsh white light displaying a priority notification from my home residential security network. I stared at the digital alert. I had personally installed those high-definition cameras 6 months after my wife passed away. Natalie had insisted on them. She claimed she was terrified I would suffer a medical emergency alone in the large empty house. She told me the surveillance system would give her peace of mind while she was living across town. I had wired the entire perimeter to make my daughter feel secure. I never imagined she would use my own defensive perimeter against me. I swiped the screen and opened the live video feed. The application loaded instantly, bridging the gap between the sterile law office and my front porch in the suburbs. The high-resolution lens captured the scene with terrifying clarity. The rain was coming down in thick gray sheets, but the covered entryway provided a dry stage for the intrusion. Natalie and Cameron were standing directly in front of my heavy oak door. They were not alone. A third individual stood slightly behind them, trying to shield himself from the damp cold. I zoomed the digital frame in on the stranger. He was a small, nervous-looking man, wearing an ill-fitting gray suit and clutching a battered leather briefcase against his chest. He did not possess the confident posture of a legal professional or the calm demeanor of a municipal worker. He looked exactly like a man who dealt in shady transactions and untraceable cash payments. He looked like a hired gun. I tapped the audio icon on the screen. I had recently upgraded the external microphones to filter out the ambient noise of the suburban traffic. The digital audio feed filled the quiet conference room with absolute crystal clarity. Russell leaned forward across the mahogany table, his eyes fixed completely on the device. We listened as the final terrifying layer of my daughter's deception revealed itself. Natalie was violently rattling the handle of the locked front door. She let out a loud, exasperated sigh and turned to the nervous man in the gray suit. She called him Dr. Aris. She demanded to know how long the legal process would take once they gained physical entry to the property. The man shifted uncomfortably and wiped the rain from his forehead. He stated in a transactional monotone voice that he needed absolute confirmation of the severe cognitive decline before he could legally sign the psychiatric evaluation forms. The sheer malice of the captured conversation paralyzed my breathing. I watched my only child cross her arms and stare directly at the hired physician. She began to recite a completely fabricated medical history with the effortless grace of a seasoned sociopath. She claimed I had been wandering the neighborhood at all hours of the night, wearing nothing but my pajamas. She told the doctor that I frequently forgot my own name and regularly held full conversations with my deceased wife in the empty living room. She painted a tragic, desperate picture of a senile old man who had completely lost his grip on reality. She stated with manufactured tears in her voice that my sudden disappearance today was the final breaking point. She insisted I was a severe physical danger to myself and needed to be placed into a secure, locked medical facility immediately. Cameron stood right beside her, nodding in solemn agreement. He added his own layer of toxic fiction to the narrative. He told the doctor that I had been making erratic and highly dangerous financial decisions over the past few weeks. He claimed I was writing massive checks to non-existent charities, leaving the stove gas running for hours, and driving my vehicle onto the neighborhood sidewalks. He created a visceral, terrifying image of a public menace. The puzzle was now entirely complete. The fraudulent mortgage was only the first phase of their attack. They knew the bank would eventually send a physical notice of the massive debt to my residential address. They knew I would inevitably discover the financial theft once I checked my mail. Their solution to that specific problem was completely diabolical. They were planning to file for an emergency medical conservatorship. They intended to use my strategic disappearance to Hawaii as the ultimate undeniable proof of my mental collapse. By the time I realized the money was gone, I would be legally stripped of my total autonomy. I would be locked away in a nursing home, stripped of my phone, and completely unable to contact an attorney or audit my own bank accounts. A court-appointed guardian controlled entirely by Natalie and Cameron would be granted absolute legal authority over my remaining assets. They would sell the house, pay off their fraudulent wedding debt, and drain my entire retirement portfolio while I rotted in a heavily medicated state in a sterile room. It was a flawless execution. They were legally murdering my independence to cover their financial crimes. I listened to the hired doctor assure them that sudden disappearances were classic textbook symptoms of advanced dementia. He promised to sign the emergency psychiatric hold the very moment they located my physical body. He told them the local courts would grant temporary guardianship within 48 hours, based solely on his expert medical testimony. Natalie smiled on the camera feed. It was a cold, victorious smile. She told Cameron to call a locksmith to drill out the front door so they could secure the property and begin packing my personal belongings for the medical facility. They were already eagerly dividing the spoils of my ruined life while standing on my welcome mat. I slowly lowered the cellular device and looked across the table at Russell. The seasoned corporate litigator sat back in his chair and exhaled a long, slow breath. He stated that we needed to contact the local authorities immediately and file a preemptive restraining order. He wanted to intercept the fraudulent medical evaluation and block their access to the property using the local police force. I raised my hand and shook my head. I told my lawyer that calling the police now would only delay the inevitable conflict. It would scare them away and allow them the crucial time needed to destroy the digital evidence they were hoarding inside their own apartment. We needed to let them execute their plan. We needed to let them confidently step into the snare they had built for me. I stood up from the leather desk chair and buttoned my suit jacket. The emotional devastation had completely burned away. The cold, engineered rage inside my chest had fully solidified into concrete. I instructed Russell to draft the exact legal countermeasures required to not only block the conservatorship, but to instantly trigger federal indictments for the fraudulent mortgage. I told him I was leaving the safety of the downtown law firm. I was going to drive directly back to my suburban neighborhood. I was not going to hide from their ambush. I was going to walk straight up my front walkway and physically confront the hired doctor, my parasitic son-in-law, and the stranger who used to be my daughter. I was going to let them spring their trap so I could personally crush their hands inside it. The heavy Portland rain battered the windshield of my car as I turned onto my quiet suburban street. The rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers was the only sound in the vehicle. I pulled to the curb a few houses down from my own property and put the engine in park. Through the gray downpour, I could clearly see the three figures standing on my covered front porch. Natalie was shivering in her expensive trench coat. Cameron was pacing back and forth with a restless, predatory energy. The hired doctor stood quietly in the corner, clutching his battered leather briefcase like a shield. They were a pack of wolves waiting for a wounded animal to return to its den. I took a deep, slow breath and closed my eyes. The time for anger had passed. The time for absolute precision had arrived. I reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror to look at my own reflection. I needed to erase the sharp, calculating civil engineer who had just spent the afternoon dissecting a massive financial crime. I needed to construct a completely different facade. I relaxed my facial muscles, letting my jaw hang slightly slack. I dropped my shoulders, allowing my spine to curve into the defeated posture of a man carrying the crushing weight of senility. I forced a slight tremor into my hands, practicing the fragile rhythm until it felt entirely natural. For my entire life, I had built bridges of steel and concrete designed to withstand hurricane winds and massive earthquakes. Today, I was building an illusion out of thin air and deliberate weakness. It needed to be absolutely flawless. I put the car in gear and slowly eased into my driveway. I made sure to park at an awkward diagonal angle, leaving the rear tire resting slightly on the wet grass of the lawn. It was a subtle detail, perfectly engineered to reinforce the narrative of a confused elderly man losing his grip on reality. I turned off the ignition and fumbled with the door handle for a few extra seconds before stepping out into the freezing rain. Natalie spotted me instantly. She let out a loud theatrical gasp and rushed down the concrete walkway to meet me. Her performance was terrifyingly convincing. She threw her arms around my shoulders, pulling me into a tight embrace that felt more like a restraining hold. She cried out my name, asking where I had been and why I had disappeared without telling anyone. Her voice was thick with manufactured panic. I leaned into her touch, allowing my body to feel heavy and completely uncoordinated. I looked at her with wide, vacant eyes. I stuttered her name, letting my voice crack and fade into a confused whisper. I asked her why she was standing in the rain and if it was time for Sunday dinner. The sheer relief that washed over her face was sickening to witness. She genuinely believed her twisted narrative was coming true right before her eyes. She turned back toward the porch and gave Cameron a sharp, victorious nod. Cameron strode down the walkway, with his chest puffed out, projecting the false authority of a man who believed he was entirely in control. He grabbed me by the elbow with a grip that was far too tight, bordering on physically abusive. He did not speak to me like a son comforting a distressed father. He spoke to me with the slow, exaggerated articulation you would use to scold a disobedient child. He told me I had caused them a massive amount of unnecessary stress and that it was time to go inside and fix the situation. I nodded meekly, letting my chin rest against my chest. I allowed Cameron to physically steer me up the concrete steps toward the front door. The hired doctor shrank back against the siding as we approached, his eyes darting nervously between the three of us. I pulled my keyring from my coat pocket. My hands were shaking violently now, a masterful display of feigned neurological decay. I fumbled with the brass keys, scratching them uselessly against the metal lock plate. The keys slipped from my trembling fingers and clattered loudly onto the wet wooden porch. Cameron let out a loud, exasperated sigh. It was the sound of towering, unearned arrogance. He bent down, snatched the keys from the floorboards, and shoved me roughly aside. He unlocked the door himself and pushed it open, stepping into my home, as if he had already claimed permanent ownership of the property. I shuffled over the threshold, trailing behind him like a broken shadow. Natalie followed closely, guiding the silent doctor inside and pulling the heavy door shut behind us. The familiar warmth of my living room usually offered a sense of deep comfort, but today it felt like a locked interrogation chamber. I stood in the center of the room, swaying slightly on my feet. I looked around at the framed family photographs and the antique grandfather clock, as if I had absolutely no idea where I was. I brought a trembling hand to my forehead and asked aloud why the lights were so bright. I repeated the question 3 times, letting my voice rise in pitch with each repetition. I asked Natalie if her mother was coming down from the bedroom to make tea. My deceased wife had been gone for years. Mentioning her as if she were still alive was the ultimate bait. It was the exact symptom of severe cognitive decline the hired doctor needed to hear. Cameron practically glowed with malignant satisfaction. He walked over to the leather recliner and firmly guided me down by the shoulders, forcing me to sit. He stood over me, crossing his arms and looking down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. He turned to the doctor and gestured toward me like I was a broken piece of furniture that needed to be hauled away to the scrapyard. He told the physician that my condition had been rapidly deteriorating for weeks, but today was the absolute worst it had ever been. He lied with incredible ease, claiming I had not slept in days and had been wandering the streets completely lost and disoriented. I shrank back against the leather cushions, pulling my knees together and wrapping my arms around my chest. I looked up at the stranger in the gray suit and asked him in a pathetic, trembling whisper if he was the man from the bank. I told him I had lost my checkbook and could not remember the numbers. I babbled incoherently about misplacing important documents and forgetting how to pay the municipal taxes. Natalie stepped forward and placed a cold hand on my knee. She looked up at the doctor with brilliant fake tears shimmering in her eyes. She stated that it broke her heart to see me in this pathetic state. She claimed she had tried everything to keep me safe at home, but I was clearly becoming a massive danger to myself and everyone around me. She begged the doctor to please help them secure the necessary paperwork to get me into a safe, locked medical facility before I accidentally burned the house down. The doctor opened his battered briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of medical evaluation forms. He did not ask me a single diagnostic question. He did not check my vital signs or attempt to orient me to reality. He simply clicked his pen and began rapidly filling out the legal documents that would strip me of my total autonomy. He mumbled that sudden severe dementia was a tragedy, but placing me in a secure conservatorship was clearly the only responsible course of action for the family to take. Cameron leaned over the back of my chair. He was so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. He whispered directly into my ear, telling me not to worry about a single thing anymore. He promised that he and Natalie were going to take over everything. They were going to manage the house, the finances, and the bank accounts. He told me I just needed to go away quietly and let the adults handle the real world. His ego was so massive, it completely blinded him to his surroundings. He was so intoxicated by the illusion of his own victory that he failed to notice the tiny red light blinking softly from the smoke detector mounted directly above his head. He failed to notice the secondary lens hidden in the bookshelf across the room. He had no idea that every arrogant smirk, every forged medical claim, and every single threat was being recorded in high-definition audio and video broadcasting directly to a secure cloud server monitored by my legal team. I looked up at his smug, triumphant face and let out a soft, pathetic whimper of complete surrender. The trap was set, the bait was fully swallowed, and the steel jaws were absolutely ready to snap shut. The heavy thud of the leather-bound folder hitting the glass surface of my coffee table echoed through the living room like a gunshot. Cameron did not gently place the documents before me. He threw them down with the aggressive theatricality of a man who believed he had already won the war. I remained seated in my worn leather recliner, keeping my shoulders hunched and my hands resting weakly on my knees. I looked up at him through half-closed eyes, maintaining the perfect illusion of a fragile, disoriented old man. He stood over me with his legs planted firmly apart, completely dominating my physical space. His tailored suit jacket was damp from the Portland rain, bringing the smell of wet wool and expensive cologne into my private sanctuary. I focused on the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of my own chest, ensuring my breathing appeared labored and shallow. Cameron did not waste time with pleasantries or false affection. The counterfeit concern he had projected on the front porch evaporated the moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind us. He pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly at the thick folder resting on the glass. He told me those were emergency power of attorney documents, drafted exclusively by his private legal counsel. He stated in a voice stripped of any familial warmth that my recent unpredictable behavior had left them with absolutely no other choice. He claimed my sudden, unannounced trip to Hawaii was a clear, undeniable sign of severe cognitive collapse. I listened to his fabricated narrative while acutely feeling the cold metal of the hidden microphone taped securely beneath my collar. I needed him to keep talking. I needed him to explicitly articulate his extortion so the federal authorities could record every single syllable. I forced a slight, pathetic tremble into my lower lip and asked him what the papers meant. Cameron smiled a cruel, lopsided grin that contorted his handsome features into something truly ugly. He leaned down, resting his palms flat on the glass table, and brought his face uncomfortably close to mine. He explained the situation with ruthless clinical clarity. He told me that Dr. Aris was waiting patiently in the hallway, completely ready to sign a binding declaration of profound mental incompetence. He painted a terrifyingly vivid picture of my immediate future if I refused to cooperate with his demands. He described a state-run psychiatric facility located in the bleak industrial outskirts of the city. He detailed the substandard living conditions, the permanently locked wards, the heavy chemical sedation, and the total, absolute loss of personal autonomy. He promised me that once the state took physical custody, I would become a nameless ward of the system, completely stripped of my assets, my home, and my dignity. He said I would spend my remaining years staring blankly at a cinder-block wall, while underpaid strangers dictated exactly when I ate and when I slept. It was a perfectly calculated nightmare designed to completely break the spirit of any sane individual. I shifted my gaze away from his arrogant face and looked directly at my daughter. Natalie was standing near the stone fireplace with her arms crossed defensively over her chest. The warm amber light from the glowing embers cast dancing shadows across her face, highlighting the cold, unyielding lines of her jaw. I called out her name using the soft, pleading tone I used to comfort her when she was a frightened little girl. I asked her if she was really going to stand by and let her husband lock me away in a terrible, miserable place. I offered her one final invisible opportunity to step back from the precipice of her own destruction. I needed to know with absolute certainty if there was even a microscopic fraction of my daughter left inside that hollow woman. Natalie uncrossed her arms and took a slow, deliberate step toward my leather chair. There was no hesitation in her eyes. There was no internal conflict, no lingering remorse, and absolutely no love. She looked down at me with an expression of pure transactional calculation. She stated in a perfectly level voice that Cameron was entirely correct. She told me I had become a massive financial and emotional burden on their marriage and their future. She claimed my stubborn grip on my assets was holding them back from achieving their true potential in life. She referenced the house, the retirement accounts, and the life insurance money as if they were already her rightful property, simply waiting to be collected from a stubborn debtor. She told me that signing the power of attorney was the only possible way to ensure I received comfortable private medical care. If I signed the papers voluntarily, they would place me in a high-end, luxury-assisted living community. If I fought them, they would let the state drag me out of my own home in a straitjacket. She delivered the brutal ultimatum with the terrifying efficiency of an executioner reading a final sentence. The sheer magnitude of their cruelty crystallized in the quiet room. They were not simply stealing my money to cover the fraudulent mortgage they had secretly taken out on my property. They were actively attempting to erase my humanity to permanently bury their crimes. They had constructed a flawless scenario where they would extract total legal control over my wealth, regardless of the path I chose. They were explicitly extorting my physical freedom in exchange for my signature. I looked back at the thick stack of legal documents resting on the glass table. The pristine white pages represented the ultimate culmination of their towering arrogance. They actually believed they could march into the house I built physically, threaten me with state-sponsored incarceration, and walk away as undisputed millionaires. They had entirely forgotten that the man sitting in front of them had spent 4 decades navigating cutthroat municipal contracts and dismantling corrupt contractors. They had completely forgotten who I truly was. Cameron reached inside his tailored jacket and produced a heavy silver fountain pen. He held it out toward me, grasping it like a triumphant prize he had just won. He instructed me to sign my name on the dotted line indicating the immediate transfer of my entire estate into their designated trust account. He told me it was the easiest and smartest choice I would ever make in my life. I slowly reached out and took the cold metal pen from his waiting grasp. My fingers trembled violently, playing the final masterful notes of my carefully orchestrated performance. I gripped the pen, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of the silver against my palm. I looked down at the blank signature line, waiting for my ink. Every passing second stretched into an agonizing eternity. I could hear the faint rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room, marking the final moments of their stolen prosperity. I could hear Cameron's shallow, excited breathing as he hovered over my shoulder. I could feel Natalie's predatory gaze burning into the top of my head. They were entirely focused on the sharp tip of the pen, waiting for the ink to finally touch the paper. They were completely oblivious to the massive federal snare closing tightly around their throats. They did not know that Russell was sitting in his secure downtown office monitoring the live audio feed with a team of seasoned federal investigators. They did not know the perimeter of the property was currently surrounded by unmarked law enforcement vehicles. They did not know that the moment I completed this transaction, the emergency injunction would instantly freeze every single financial account attached to their names. I lowered the tip of the pen toward the crisp white paper. I let out a soft, defeated sigh, perfectly mirroring the utter capitulation of a broken man. I prepared to give them exactly what they wanted, knowing with absolute certainty that it would be the very instrument of their complete destruction. The heavy silver fountain pen hovered just millimeters above the crisp white paper. I could feel the microscopic vibrations of my own staged trembling traveling down the barrel of the pen. Cameron shifted his weight impatiently. His breathing was shallow and rapid. He was a predator seconds away from consuming his prey. Natalie stood by the fireplace, perfectly still. Her eyes were locked onto my hand, waiting for the ink to permanently sign away my freedom. The silence in the living room was absolute and suffocating. I let out one final, pathetic sigh. I lowered the metal tip of the pen until it was a hair's breadth from the signature line. Then the heavy, solid oak doors of my adjacent study swung open. The sound was not loud, but in that breathless vacuum it echoed like a physical detonation. Cameron flinched violently. He spun around, his expensive suit jacket whipping through the air. Natalie let out a sharp gasp, taking a sudden step backward until her shoulder hit the cold stone of the fireplace. The doorway to the study was completely dark for a fraction of a second. Then the harsh, bright glare of the overhead fluorescent lights snapped on, illuminating the two men stepping out from the shadows. Russell walked into the living room first. He wore a dark tailored suit and an expression of absolute predatory calm. He did not look at Natalie or Cameron. His eyes were fixed completely on the documents resting on my glass coffee table. Walking directly beside him was a tall, imposing man wearing a tactical windbreaker over a shirt and tie. The gold shield of the State Financial Fraud Division hung heavily from a leather lanyard around his neck. The atmosphere in the room shattered instantly. The toxic, suffocating tension of their extortion was completely obliterated by the sudden, terrifying arrival of the law. I did not slowly rise from my chair. I did not stumble or shake. I dropped the heavy silver pen onto the glass table. The metal clattered loudly, rolling away from the unsigned documents. I planted my feet firmly on the floor and stood up to my full height. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back and lifting my chin. The fragile, disoriented old man vanished entirely. The trembling hands steadied. The vacant, confused stare hardened into a cold, uncompromising glare. I looked directly at my daughter and let my facial muscles set into stone. The architectural demolition had officially begun. Cameron was completely paralyzed. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. His arrogant posture collapsed as his mind desperately tried to process the impossible scene unfolding in front of him. Natalie stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. She watched my physical transformation with absolute horror. She realized in that exact moment that she had not been manipulating a sick, vulnerable father. She had been blindly walking into a meticulously engineered snare. The state investigator stepped forward and clearly identified himself. His voice was deep and authoritative, instantly commanding the space. He stated that he was operating in coordination with federal authorities and that this residence was currently an active crime scene. He instructed everyone to remain exactly where they were and to keep their hands completely visible. Russell did not waste a single second with pleasantries. He walked directly to the glass coffee table. He picked up the fraudulent power of attorney document Cameron had just tried to force me to sign. Russell looked at it with pure disgust. He ripped the pristine white pages completely in half and let the pieces flutter onto the floor. Then he reached inside his own leather briefcase. He produced 3 distinct, heavily bound folders and threw them down onto the table. The heavy thuds echoed through the room like falling hammers. He pointed to the first folder. His voice was sharp and relentless. He announced that those were the certified bank records proving the fraudulent mortgage they had illegally taken out on my property. He looked directly at Cameron and detailed the exact alphanumeric sequences they had stolen from my deceased wife to bypass the security protocols. He stated the exact time and location of the digital breach, tracing it perfectly back to their luxury apartment. Cameron stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the sofa. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly ashen gray. Russell pointed to the second folder. He announced that those pages contained the comprehensive money laundering trail. He detailed the massive $50,000 wire transfer to the exclusive private vineyard. He listed the luxury caterers, the imported florists, and the expensive transportation fleet. He told them the state now possessed undeniable concrete evidence that they had used stolen equity to fund a lavish $100,000 wedding event. He looked at Natalie and stated that the federal government does not look kindly upon individuals who use illegally obtained funds to finance their vanity projects across state banking lines. Natalie began to shake. Her perfect, pristine facade completely dissolved. She looked at me with tears spilling over her eyelashes, pleading silently for me to stop the nightmare. I offered her absolutely nothing. My expression remained entirely blank. The father she was looking for had died the moment I read those bank statements in the downtown law firm. Russell dropped his hand onto the third and final folder. He turned his attention to the hired doctor standing frozen in the corner of the room. Russell stated that the third folder contained a fully documented history of elder abuse and attempted medical fraud. He pointed to the ceiling, indicating the hidden cameras and the concealed audio microphones. He informed the room that every single threat, every fabricated medical symptom, and every attempt at extortion had been recorded in high definition. The footage was already uploading to a secure server monitored by the authorities. The hired doctor let out a sound that was half gasp and half whimper. He looked at the federal agent and then at the massive stack of incriminatory evidence. He was not a hardened criminal. He was a greedy opportunist who thought he was making quick, untraceable cash by signing a simple form for a wealthy family. The sudden realization that he was caught in a massive federal sting operation completely broke his nerve. He realized he was facing years in a state penitentiary and the permanent revocation of his medical license. The doctor did not try to defend himself. He did not look at Natalie or Cameron for support. He simply dropped his battered leather briefcase onto the hardwood floor. The brass clasps snapped open, spilling blank psychiatric evaluation forms across the rug. He stammered a pathetic, incoherent apology, raising his hands in the air as if trying to physically ward off the incoming prison sentence. He turned around and sprinted toward the front door. He scrambled with the deadbolt, his hands slipping on the brass lock in his sheer panic. He threw the heavy oak door open and ran blindly out into the pouring rain, entirely abandoning his co-conspirators to their fate. The front door remained wide open, letting the cold, damp wind sweep through the living room. The sound of the doctor's frantic footsteps splashing down the concrete walkway faded into the distance. Cameron sank onto the sofa, completely defeated, his head resting heavily in his hands. Natalie stood frozen by the fireplace, trapped in the agonizing silence of her ruined life. They had nowhere left to run. They had absolutely no excuses left to fabricate. The walls of their deception had been completely demolished, and they were utterly buried under the rubble. I stood in the center of my home, feeling the cold, fresh air wash over me. The trap was permanently closed. The heavy silence left in the wake of the fleeing doctor did not last long. The absolute shock that had temporarily paralyzed my daughter finally shattered, giving way to a feral, uncontrollable rage. Natalie pushed herself away from the cold stone of the fireplace, her hands balling into tight, white-knuckled fists. Her face, usually a mask of carefully curated elegance and manufactured grace, twisted into an expression of pure, venomous hatred. She lunged forward, across the expensive Persian rug, screaming my name with a volume that echoed violently off the high-vaulted ceilings of the living room. She abandoned the sweet, concerned daughter routine entirely and unleashed the vicious, entitled predator she truly was. She cursed me. She called me a pathetic, vindictive old man who was deliberately trying to destroy her happiness and ruin her future. Her voice grew louder and more erratic with every frantic step she took toward my chair. She demanded her money. She shrieked that she was legally and morally entitled to her rightful share of the trust fund. She invoked the memory of her deceased mother, claiming that my late wife had explicitly promised her financial security and a substantial inheritance. She stood merely inches from my face, her breath ragged and uneven, demanding that I immediately instruct Russell to release the frozen bank accounts and halt the federal investigation. She threatened to drag my reputation through the mud. She promised to publicly humiliate me in the local community and tie my estate up in endless, suffocating litigation until I had absolutely nothing left to my name. She threw a massive temper tantrum born of pure, unadulterated panic, realizing that her luxurious lifestyle was evaporating right before her eyes. I did not flinch. I did not lean away from her aggressive posture, and I certainly did not raise my voice to match her frantic hysteria. I stood perfectly still, letting her toxic words wash over me like a brief, meaningless storm passing against a concrete wall. The stark contrast between her desperate flailing and my absolute unwavering composure was the ultimate victory. I looked past her shoulder at Cameron, who was still slumped heavily on the leather sofa. He was staring blankly at the hardwood floor, completely broken by the severe federal indictments Russell had just laid out. He offered his wife no support and no defense. I turned my attention back to the screaming woman standing in front of me. I reached into the interior breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I did not pull out a pen or a checkbook or a finalized trust agreement. I retrieved a single folded document. The paper was thick, heavy stock and officially stamped with a raised golden municipal seal. I held it out, holding it perfectly steady in the space between us. Natalie stopped screaming. Her frantic tirade died in her throat. Her eyes darted down to the official paper, her chest heaving violently as she tried to catch her breath. She asked me what it was, her voice dropping into a raspy, venomous whisper. I spoke with a cold, precise clarity that filled every corner of the quiet room. I told her it was the final absolute nail in the coffin she had so carefully built for herself. I slowly unfolded the heavy document and placed it gently on the glass coffee table right next to the shredded remains of her fraudulent power of attorney. I instructed her to read the bold black print at the very top of the page. It was a finalized, irreversible deed of sale. I explained that while she and Cameron were busy forging medical records, hiring corrupt physicians, and planning my illegal incarceration, I had been conducting my own private business transactions. I had not simply transferred the property into a protected family trust to hide it from her grasp. I had executed a total, comprehensive liquidation of the estate. I had sold the entire property. I had sold the main house, the surrounding acreage, the detached carpentry workshop, and every single fixture attached to the land to a massive multinational corporate real estate conglomerate. The color drained completely from Natalie's face as my words registered in her mind. I watched the arrogant certainty vanish from her eyes, replaced by an absolute bottomless dread. I told her that the corporate entity had wired the purchase funds directly into a highly secure offshore account that she would never, under any circumstances, be able to access, touch, or litigate against. I explained that this specific conglomerate specialized in aggressive commercial property development and retained an army of ruthless corporate attorneys whose sole purpose was to crush fraudulent claims and deal with trespassers. The ground she was currently standing on, the hardwood floors she had planned to sand and remodel, the spacious living room she had mentally claimed as her own personal domain, no longer belonged to me. More importantly, it absolutely did not belong to her. The house was now the exclusive legal property of a faceless billion-dollar corporation. They had permitted me a strict 30-day leaseback agreement to handle my final personal affairs and manage my physical relocation. I was no longer the owner of the estate. I was simply a temporary tenant, packing my bags. Natalie stared at the golden seal on the document, as if it were a highly venomous snake preparing to strike. Her legs finally gave out beneath her. She sank onto the edge of the glass coffee table, her hands gripping the smooth edges tightly just to keep from falling entirely to the floor. The profound realization of her total, unconditional defeat crushed the remaining air from her lungs. She had gambled her marriage, her professional reputation, and her physical freedom on the absolute certainty of my paternal weakness. She had bet everything on the arrogant assumption that she could weaponize my age and my grief to effortlessly steal my wealth. Instead, she had walked blindly and confidently directly into a masterfully designed counteroffensive that stripped her of every single asset she desperately craved. Cameron let out a low, agonizing groan from the leather sofa. The reality of the corporate sale finally penetrated his shock. He finally understood that the massive wedding debt he had accumulated using my forged signature was now entirely his own permanent burden. There would be no stolen house to sell to cover the fraudulent loans. There would be no family trust fund to raid for legal fees. There would be nothing waiting for them tomorrow but federal charges crushing financial ruin and public disgrace. I looked down at the two strangers sitting defeated in my living room. They were completely stripped of their arrogance, their power, and their false dignity. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of closure wash through my chest. The deep, agonizing wound of their betrayal had finally been cauterized by the absolute finality of justice. I turned to the state financial fraud investigator standing quietly near the study doorway. I nodded to him, signaling that my personal business was entirely concluded. The investigator stepped forward, his heavy tactical boots thudding loudly against the hardwood floor. He informed Natalie and Cameron in a strict, authoritative tone that they were currently trespassing on private corporate property. He instructed them to stand up and walk toward the front door immediately, without gathering any belongings. He stated clearly that if they refused to comply with his direct order, they would be physically removed, placed in handcuffs, and charged with unlawful entry, on top of the pending federal indictments waiting for them at the station. Cameron was the first to move. He stood up on violently shaking legs, completely ignoring his wife sitting on the table. He did not look at me or the lawyer as he walked slowly toward the exit. His shoulders slumped forward in absolute, total defeat. Natalie remained sitting on the edge of the glass table for a moment longer, her eyes fixed blankly on the floor. She whispered my name one final time, her voice a pathetic, broken plea for a loving father who no longer existed in this world. I did not answer her. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply pointed my index finger toward the open front door, where the cold Portland rain was still falling heavily onto the porch. She slowly pushed herself up from the table. She wrapped her expensive imported trench coat tightly around her shivering shoulders and walked out of my life forever. Russell and the state investigator followed them out into the raging storm, ensuring they completely left the perimeter of the corporate property. I walked over to the heavy oak door and pushed it shut against the wind. The solid metallic click of the deadbolt locking firmly into place was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I stood alone in the quiet hallway, surrounded by the familiar walls of the home I had loved and maintained for decades. The toxic, parasitic presence of greed and manipulation had been entirely purged from the atmosphere. I had lost a daughter to her own unchecked ambition, but I had successfully defended my dignity, my autonomy, and the legacy I had built with my wife. I walked back into the living room and picked up the heavy silver fountain pen from the glass table. I slipped it into my pocket and turned off the overhead lights. The war was officially over, and the deep silence in the house was finally a silence of absolute, enduring peace. The collapse of Cameron and Natalie was not a slow decline. It was a sudden, catastrophic freefall. The federal machinery, once fully engaged, moves with a cold, mechanical efficiency that completely ignores human panic. Monday morning brought the first wave of absolute destruction. Cameron attempted to use his platinum corporate credit card at an upscale coffee shop downtown. The transaction was instantly declined. Annoyed and completely arrogant, he logged into his mobile banking application, expecting to see a simple security hold that he could easily bypass with an angry phone call. Instead, his screen displayed a sequence of zeros across every single checking and savings account. A sterile digital message instructed him to contact his financial institution immediately. By noon, federal investigators from the Financial Fraud Division had executed emergency warrants. They had successfully frozen every account tied to his name, her name, and the fraudulent trust they had established to hold my stolen equity. The money they had laundered from the forged mortgage was completely locked down under strict federal mandate. Cameron was instantly stripped of his entire financial identity. Natalie experienced her own brutal awakening just a few hours later. She was sitting in the sprawling living room of their rented luxury penthouse, entirely oblivious to the federal actions targeting her husband. A sharp, heavy knock on her heavy designer door interrupted her quiet morning. It was not a delivery driver bringing imported floral arrangements or luxury garments. It was a pair of county sheriffs accompanied by the highly agitated property manager of the building. The fraudulent funds Cameron had used to prepay their exorbitant lease had been flagged and officially reversed by the federal probe. The management company, wanting absolutely zero connection to a high-profile federal money laundering investigation, executed an immediate emergency eviction protocol. Natalie was handed a formal legal notice to vacate the premises within 24 hours. The sheriffs stood in her expensive marble foyer with their hands resting near their duty belts, ensuring she understood the absolute finality of the court document. She frantically tried to call Cameron to fix the situation, but his phone had already been confiscated as direct evidence by the federal agents currently executing a search warrant at his boutique investment firm. The speed of their ruin was breathtaking to observe from a distance. For 3 years, they had operated under the supreme delusion of invincibility. They had built an entire marriage on a toxic foundation of stolen equity and unearned arrogance. Now that foundation was dissolving into ash right beneath their feet. Without access to their frozen bank accounts, they could not hire a seasoned criminal defense attorney to protect them. Without their luxury apartment, they were completely homeless. Their wealthy socialite friends, the very people they had tried to impress with their lavish stolen wedding, instantly abandoned them the moment the fraud probe became public knowledge. The local society pages whispered about the upcoming federal indictments. The couple was ultimately forced to check into a cheap, damp roadside motel on the industrial outskirts of the city, using the last few crumpled $20 bills Cameron had left in his leather wallet. The stark, humiliating contrast between their stolen penthouse and a poorly lit motel room broke whatever remained of their arrogant spirits. They were entirely isolated and terrified. It took exactly 4 days for their sheer desperation to completely override their towering pride. Russell contacted me on a Thursday afternoon with a tone of quiet satisfaction in his voice. He stated that Cameron and Natalie had practically begged his legal secretary for a brief mediation meeting. They had absolutely no legal leverage left. They had no money to offer for a settlement. They were facing imminent federal arrest warrants and a mandatory minimum of a decade in a federal penitentiary. They were coming to me strictly to beg for their physical survival. I instructed Russell to arrange the meeting in his downtown conference room. I wanted them to return to the exact same sterile, glass-walled room where I had first discovered the depth of their ultimate betrayal. I wanted the poetry of the location to perfectly frame their total defeat. I arrived early and took my seat at the head of the polished mahogany table. The Portland sky outside the heavy window panes was a brilliant, unforgiving blue, which provided a stark contrast to the rainy afternoon when my world had temporarily shattered. At precisely 2 o'clock, the heavy glass doors opened. Natalie and Cameron walked into the room. The physical toll of the past 96 hours was shockingly evident on both of their faces. Cameron looked ashen and hollow. His designer suit was heavily wrinkled and stained. His posture was completely defeated. He looked exactly like a man walking toward his own execution. Natalie was a pale, trembling ghost of the vicious woman who had screamed at me in my living room just days prior. Her immaculate hair was tied back in a messy, tangled knot. Her eyes were red and severely swollen, devoid of any manufactured confidence or predatory calculation. They sat across from me, gripping each other's hands in a display of sheer mutual terror. Cameron spoke first. His voice was a pathetic, cracked whisper that barely carried across the polished wood. He did not attempt to deny the massive fraud. He did not offer any arrogant excuses for his behavior. He completely and unconditionally surrendered. He confessed to forging the mortgage documents and laundering the stolen funds to cover their massive lifestyle debts. He admitted to hiring the fraudulent doctor to stage the emergency conservatorship. He threw himself entirely on my mercy, begging me to intervene with the federal prosecutor on his behalf. He pleaded for a mediation settlement, promising to spend the rest of his natural life working menial jobs to repay every single stolen dollar if I would just drop the criminal charges. He sobbed openly. He was a grown man, weeping in a corporate law office, completely terrified of the brutal prison sentence waiting for him. Natalie leaned forward, letting her tears fall freely onto the mahogany table. She looked at me and called me Dad. It was the first time she had used the word without dripping toxic manipulation. She begged me to remember her childhood. She pleaded with me to remember the innocent little girl I had raised and the daughter who used to hold my hand walking to school. She swore she was blinded by Cameron and manipulated by severe financial stress. She claimed she was deeply terrified of losing her social standing and made a terrible, unforgivable mistake. She begged for my absolute forgiveness. She asked me to sign a federal leniency agreement, which was a document that would signal to the judge that the primary victim requested extreme mercy for the defendants. She promised to walk away from everything and never bother me again. She swore to live quietly in poverty if I would just save her from being locked inside a federal cell. I sat perfectly still, letting their desperate, pathetic apologies echo against the thick glass walls of the conference room. I looked closely at the two broken strangers sitting across from me. A year ago, their tears would have shattered my heart into a million pieces. A year ago, I would have moved heaven and earth to protect my only daughter from experiencing any pain or hardship. But the man who would have saved them was dead. They had maliciously murdered him the exact moment they decided my life and my freedom were merely financial obstacles to be discarded. I looked deeply into Natalie's swollen eyes. I did not see a frightened little girl asking for her father. I saw a ruthless, cornered predator caught in a steel trap of her own making, weeping only because she had finally lost the game. I placed my hands flat on the polished table. I did not raise my voice or offer a single ounce of comfort. I looked at my daughter and told her that forgiveness was a luxury reserved strictly for human beings who were capable of genuine remorse. The heavy mahogany table felt like an impenetrable border wall between my past and my future. Natalie sat trembling with her hands clasped tightly together in a pathetic posture of prayer. Her eyes were completely bloodshot and stripped of all the arrogant entitlement that had defined her existence for the past 3 years. She was waiting for the familiar warmth of paternal surrender. She was waiting for the old man to absorb her pain and shield her from the brutal consequences of the real world. I looked directly into her eyes and let the silence stretch until it became physically suffocating. I told her in a voice devoid of any anger that her tears were completely hollow. She was not crying for the father she had tried to legally erase. She was mourning the permanent loss of her luxury apartment, her designer wardrobe, and her stolen social status. I informed her that signing a leniency agreement would be an endorsement of her crimes. I told her I absolutely refused to finance my own destruction. I stood up from my leather chair, pushing it back slowly. I stated that the federal prosecutor would determine her exact fate, and I would not lift a single finger to alter the trajectory of justice. Cameron let out a sound that resembled a dying animal. He buried his face in his hands, realizing the final safety net had been completely severed. They had mistaken my lifelong generosity for incurable weakness. They had assumed that a father's love was an infinite resource to be endlessly mined and exploited regardless of their actions. I looked down at the two strangers who had planned to lock me in a cinder-block cell, and I felt a profound, liberating emptiness. I buttoned my suit jacket and walked toward the glass doors of the conference room. Natalie called out my name one final time, her voice cracking in a desperate, breathless plea. I did not turn around. I did not pause my stride. I walked out into the carpeted hallway and left them entirely alone with the wreckage of their own malice. Russell followed me out, silently closing the heavy glass doors on the remnants of my former family. The transaction was officially complete, and the cord was permanently cut. The following weeks moved with a rapid surgical precision. I authorized Russell to immediately liquidate every remaining asset I possessed within the state of Oregon. There were no sentimental attachments left to bind me to the damp, gray weather of Portland. I sold my remaining stock portfolios and closed out the local banking accounts. I liquidated the vintage car collection I had meticulously maintained in my garage for 20 years. Every single physical tether to my old life was methodically converted into clean, untraceable capital. I stood in the empty rooms of a temporary corporate rental, signing the final digital transfer documents on my portable tablet. The sheer volume of wealth I had accumulated over 40 years of engineering was finally consolidated into a secure, heavily encrypted offshore trust. It was a fortress of financial security that no corrupt doctor or greedy relative could ever breach. Once the local accounts were zeroed out, I purchased a one-way first-class ticket across the Pacific. I officially changed my permanent legal residency to the island of Maui. It was the exact destination my late wife and I had dreamed about during those long, rainy winters. We had spent decades looking at glossy brochures of volcanic coastlines and warm tropical beaches, promising each other we would eventually retire in paradise. She never got the chance to make the journey. I was going to honor her memory by living the exact life we had planned, without the toxic anchor of ungrateful children weighing me down. I bought a beautiful, secluded property overlooking the ocean. The house was surrounded by lush, tropical foliage and the constant, soothing rhythm of crashing waves. The air was perpetually warm and tasted of sea salt. I furnished the rooms with simple, elegant pieces, deliberately avoiding the heavy, ornate clutter that had defined my previous existence. I woke up every morning to the bright island sunrise, feeling a profound, absolute peace that I had not experienced in over a decade. While I watched the sunset from my wooden lanai thousands of miles away, Natalie and Cameron were brutally introduced to the harsh, uncompromising reality of their choices. The federal judge overseeing their case did not show them a single ounce of leniency. The court recognized the sheer predatory nature of their crimes. They had actively targeted a vulnerable senior citizen, attempting to strip him of his fundamental human rights for pure financial gain. They narrowly avoided maximum security federal prison, but the alternative was arguably a much harsher punishment for people obsessed with social status. The judge handed down a massive court-ordered restitution mandate. They were legally obligated to repay every single stolen dollar, including the exorbitant legal fees I had incurred defending my own sanity. Their wages would be aggressively garnished for the rest of their natural lives. The reality of their new existence was stark and completely unforgiving. Stripped of their stolen luxury vehicles and their fraudulent credit limits, they were instantly cast out of the wealthy circles they had so desperately tried to infiltrate. They were forced to move into a rundown, damp basement apartment in a neglected industrial neighborhood on the very edge of the city limits. The floors were cracked linoleum, and the single window looked out onto a concrete alleyway filled with rusted dumpsters. There were no designer floral arrangements or expensive imported wines. There was only the constant crushing pressure of survival. Cameron, a man who had proudly worn tailored suits and mocked the working class, was forced to accept a grueling minimum wage position at a commercial laundry facility. He spent 10 hours a day hauling heavy-soaked linens, breathing in toxic bleach fumes, and answering to a supervisor half his age. His hands quickly became raw and blistered, a stark physical reminder of his total failure. Natalie, whose entire identity was built on aesthetic superiority, took a job working the overnight shift at a local diner. She spent her nights scrubbing greasy, flat-top grills and serving cheap coffee to exhausted truck drivers. The sheer physical exhaustion stripped away her arrogance, leaving behind a hollow, exhausted shell of a woman. Every single paycheck they earned was immediately intercepted by the federal courts, leaving them with barely enough money to buy cheap groceries and pay the rent on their miserable basement dwelling. They had attempted to engineer a reality where I would spend my final years locked in a bleak, neglected facility staring at a blank wall. Instead, they had perfectly engineered that exact nightmare for themselves. They were entirely trapped in a prison poem made of their own crushing debt and physical exhaustion. They had traded their morality for a brief, fleeting taste of unearned luxury, and the resulting bill was going to take a lifetime to settle. I sat on my quiet porch in Maui, listening to the gentle ocean breeze rustle through the palm trees. I sipped my coffee and watched the horizon turn a brilliant shade of gold. I did not feel any lingering bitterness or anger. I simply felt the profound, quiet satisfaction of a man who had successfully defended his own life. The ledger was permanently balanced. The warm golden sand sifted smoothly between my toes as I walked along the shoreline of my new reality. The Pacific Ocean stretched out infinitely before me, a vast expanse of deep turquoise water that met the cloudless sky at a perfectly straight horizon. The rhythmic crashing of the waves against the smooth volcanic rocks was the only sound for miles. It was a hypnotic, grounding melody that washed away the lingering echoes of the bitter rain in Portland. The air here tasted distinctly of sea salt and blooming tropical flowers. It was completely pure and untainted. I found a quiet spot near a grove of swaying palm trees and sat down on the earth. I folded my hands over my knees and simply breathed. For the first time in over 3 years, every single breath felt effortless. The crushing, suffocating weight of anticipation was completely gone. I was no longer waiting for a forged document to appear in my mail. I was no longer listening for the sharp, aggressive click of my daughter's designer heels on my hardwood floors. I was no longer bracing myself for a fabricated medical emergency or a hostile legal ambush. The heavy armor I had been forced to wear inside my own home was finally unbuckled and discarded. The profound silence that wrapped around me was incredibly beautiful. It was not the tense, terrifying silence of a predator waiting in the dark. It was the absolute, impenetrable silence of a life entirely free from manipulation and deceit. I closed my eyes and let the warm Hawaiian breeze brush against my face. The contrast between this serene environment and the sterile glass-walled conference room of my lawyer's office was staggering. In that cold room, I had been forced to witness the total moral collapse of my own flesh and blood. I had watched the child I raised attempt to legally erase my humanity for the sake of a luxury apartment and imported wine. Now, sitting on this peaceful beach, that nightmare felt like a distant, faded memory belonging to another lifetime. The toxic fog of their continuous gaslighting had completely lifted. My mind, which they had tried so desperately to label as broken and senile, operated with absolute crystalline clarity. I knew exactly who I was, where I was, and what I had survived. Order had been completely and permanently restored to my universe. As a civil engineer, my entire professional life had been dedicated to establishing structural integrity and ensuring mathematical balance. When a foundation is compromised by parasitic rot, you do not politely ask the rot to leave. You excise it completely. You rebuild the support columns with hardened steel, and you pour fresh concrete. That is exactly what I had done with my personal life. The legal and emotional boundaries I had drawn were now towering, impenetrable walls. Natalie and Cameron existed on the other side of those walls, completely cut off from my energy, my wealth, and my peace. There were no hidden loopholes they could exploit. There were no emotional vulnerabilities left for them to weaponize. They could no longer use my paternal love as a Trojan horse to infiltrate my sanctuary. I had officially severed the cord, and the resulting freedom was truly exhilarating. I opened my eyes and watched the sun begin its slow, majestic descent toward the horizon. The sky began to transition from a brilliant blue into a spectacular canvas of vibrant orange, deep magenta, and rich violet. The light danced across the rolling surface of the water, creating a shimmering pathway of gold that seemed to lead directly to where I was sitting. It was a visual representation of a closing chapter. I thought about the concept of family. For decades, I had believed that biological ties were an unbreakable sacred bond. I had believed that providing endless financial and emotional support would automatically generate mutual respect and lifelong loyalty. I had to learn the hardest lesson a father can possibly learn. Biology does not grant anyone the right to become your abuser. True family protects your vulnerabilities instead of exploiting them. I allowed myself a quiet moment to mourn the daughter I had imagined I possessed. I mourned the little girl who used to hold my hand while we walked through the park, but I felt absolutely no grief for the ruthless, calculating woman she had ultimately chosen to become. My closure was total and absolute. There were no lingering regrets and no desperate desires to fix something that was fundamentally broken. The sunset deepened, casting long, peaceful shadows across the pristine beach. I thought about my late wife. We had spent so many dark, freezing winters in Oregon, staring at glossy travel brochures, promising each other we would eventually escape to this exact island. We had dreamed of building a quiet life together, far away from the relentless demands of the corporate world. She did not survive long enough to make the journey, but I had brought her memory with me. I knew with absolute certainty that she would be profoundly proud of the man sitting on this beach. She would be proud that I did not surrender the legacy we had built together to the greedy hands of two entitled strangers. She would be proud of the iron boundaries I had established to protect the dignity of our life's work. I was living the dream we had carefully designed, and I was honoring her memory by refusing to be a tragic victim. At 65 years old, society often expects a man to quietly step aside. My daughter and her husband had banked their entire fraudulent scheme on that exact societal expectation. They believed my age equated to weakness. They assumed my grief had rendered me docile and easily conquered. They severely miscalculated the quiet, dangerous wisdom that comes with surviving 6 decades on this earth. My dignity was not something they could simply pack into a briefcase and steal. My autonomy was not a negotiable asset. My dignity remained entirely intact, forged in the fires of their betrayal and hardened by the swift, decisive justice I had orchestrated. They tried to push me into an early grave, but they only succeeded in pushing me into a tropical paradise. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky glowing with the soft, peaceful light of twilight. The ocean continued its steady, soothing rhythm against the shore. I took a deep breath of the fragrant evening air, feeling a profound sense of triumph that required no audience, no applause, and no external validation. I was a free man. I was secure in my new home, secure in my mind, and perfectly content in the silence. The trap was broken, the predators were banished, and my unbreakable peace had finally begun. True character is not defined by how we act when we possess absolute power, but by the boundaries we maintain when those who betrayed us are completely stripped of theirs. The profound lesson learned from this ordeal is that unconditional love must never equate to unconditional tolerance for abuse. We are often taught that family ties require endless forgiveness, but genuine respect is the foundational currency of any relationship. When individuals weaponize familial bonds for financial exploitation, they forfeit the right to parental shelter. Justice requires us to stand firm in our own dignity, refusing to finance our own destruction out of misplaced guilt. If you found value in this story of reclaiming personal power, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments below.